Thank you for joining us. I am with the Division of Forestry. I've been working with private landowners for 28 years and then several years before that on public forest land. So I've been around quite a bit. I've seen a lot of things, but I'm always learning new things too. And I hope I can answer many of your questions today. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll address them afterwards. So let's just jump right in right now. So the question is, are you thinking about selling timber? And I think that the first question to ask is, why? Why are you thinking of selling timber? What is motivating you? Liz, my presentation just went away.
We didn't see it to begin with, so maybe you
Really?
didn't hit share. Maybe you hit open and not share.
Hang on.
Nothing like a good practice to jinx
Right.
yourself, right?
And it worked so well before too. Okay. Are you seeing anything now?
No. Did you hit share screen?
Thought I did. Okay, hang on. This is always very annoying to me when these things happen too. Okay. Down there. Okay, it says that one participant can share at a time.
Let me make you host instead of co-host.
Okay.
I won't have any control, only you will, but maybe that'll help.
All right.
Okay. Now you're sharing, but you're sharing
now
Zoom screen instead of your, yeah, there you go.
Okay, so let me get into the beginning there. There we go. All right. Are we good?
We're great.
Okay, good. Again, so if you're thinking about selling timber, the question is, why are you doing that? And is it money that's motivating you? Right now, timber prices are up. I am getting a lot of questions from people saying, hey, should I sell timber? I hear prices are really good right now. So that's one thing, and that's market driven type things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But maybe you're wanting to sell timber because you've heard that, hey, you didn't get a good price for it, and you're in a position in your life where you need the money for something. Maybe you've got health issues, maybe you've got a child going off to college, and suddenly you have these big expenses. So that may be a reason to sell timber. Maybe your neighbor sold timber and they were kind of bragging, or you heard through the grapevine that, wow, look at how many thousands of dollars my neighbor got for their timber. So my woods has got to be worth at least that much. And it may not necessarily be true. But again, that may be a reason to get you thinking about selling timber. There may have been a storm that's gone through, or some other natural disaster that's caused an issue in your woods. And so a salvage harvest may be the reason to have a timber sale at this point in time. The emerald ash borer was mentioned earlier by a couple of you. And when emerald ash borer came through my part of the state, and like I think Liz said, a lot of people got into the woods and started having timber harvests to start salvaging out that material before it was completely lost. I think someone also mentioned that they had been contacted by a timber buyer, and that seems to be fairly common. That may be a solicitation letter through the mail from a company you've never heard of that's not even close to your woods. It is not illegal for people to do that. That's a question I get asked. And that information about who owns land is freely available, particularly now with the internet. Anybody can go online, look in a county and see where the woodlands are, and then get your contact information and send you a letter about that. Sometimes a timber buyer may just come to your door and say, hey, I see you've got some woodlands. I'd like to go in there and take a look and then see what you got there, and I'll come back and talk to you about it. Again, nothing illegal about that. And if you want to do that, that's fine. You may get a little bit of information there, but I would give you some cautions there, and we'll talk about those cautions a little bit later. Sometimes the timber buyer actually goes into your woods first and then comes to your door and says, hey, you know what? You got $70,000 worth of timber out there. I'd sure like to buy it. I have a real issue with that because, first of all, they've trespassed on your property, and then they're throwing this number at you, and you've got nothing to compare it with. You don't know whether that is a reasonable number. Don't know. I think one of the main things that you should be asking on the why part of should you sell timber, it should be part of your long range plan. And again, we're going to get to talking about plans here in a few minutes. So when you think about whether you should harvest, ask yourself the question, is it appropriate for your resource? And there's a lot of reasons why it may or may not be appropriate. Your woods is different than your neighbor's woods. So just because they sold timber doesn't mean that your land, because your land has been managed differently than your neighbor's land. The other thing too is if you're thinking about selling and whether you should, are you mentally prepared for the change that's going to happen to your woods? Because it is going to change. Now, it should change for the better. But again, it is going to be a change. So if you're used to looking at your kitchen window and seeing this beautiful woodlands out in front of you, timber harvest is going to change that. So just be prepared for that. The other thing too is there may be some tax implications. You are going to receive several $1,000s probably for your timber, and you have to be prepared as how are you going to handle that money is in regards to taxes. Are you going to have to pay taxes on that money? And there are individuals out there who can help you with that. Market conditions. Markets are always changing. This is an agricultural product. And unfortunately, unlike traditional ag, corn, beans, cattle, you can't listen to the Brownfield Network and find out what the markets are doing right now. And that's where having some help will help you decide whether what you have in your woods is at the appropriate time in regards to the markets. It's going to depend on the species that are being sold out of your woods and also its timing. About 18 to 24 months ago, some of the markets were not doing well, with the exception of the fact that white oak was doing extremely well. And there was a specific reason for that. And that's because of the bourbon industry. People have rediscovered that particular liquor, and it has to be put into wooden barrels, and those wooden barrels are made out of white oak. And so the stave market was really doing very well. It continues to do well today. So all those things are some considerations when you're thinking about the harvest. The other thing too is access. Do you have access to your woods? A lot of people have great access. Some people have very, very poor access. So is your access year-round? Can you get to it easily? Not a problem. Or is it seasonal? In other words, if you have to have the yarding area in an agricultural field, there may be limitations on when you want those loggers to be in there, and you may actually end up having a longer contract also to allow for those times when they can't be in there. So maybe you've got some wet areas too, that's going to impact your access. I think someone mentioned they had woods in Jennings County, and there's a lot of flatwoods over there, which look great, but they are very, very wet. And so again, harvesting can only take place at certain times, and access into those woods is just going to be very limited because of those type of conditions. Maybe you don't have any access at all, but the best access is to go through your neighbor. Hopefully you've got good relations with your neighbor, but someone's going to have to negotiate some access with that neighboring property. And it's not unreasonable to expect that you are going to have to pay for that access. Now, whether you pay for it or the logger pays for it, again, that has to be worked out, preferably before the timber is even put on the market, because that will affect the price that you receive from the logger. If that logger has to buy the access, he's probably going to pay you a little bit less. Or if he's unsure that he can even get access, he may not even want to bid on your timber. So those things are things to consider. Are you going to have to put down rock to get off of the county road or the highway into the woodlands? And if so, who's going to pay for that? Are you going to do that yourself, or are you going to allow the logger to do it? And again, if the logger has to do it, he may drop the price that he offers you a little bit less for your timber. And sometimes there are local restrictions. That's not uncommon, particularly in the springtime. A lot of counties will put on weight limit on the county roads, because during the freeze thaw period in the early spring, late winter, early spring, heavy equipment can really do a lot of damage. There are some places where that restriction may be year round too. A few counties do have restrictions like that. So make sure that you're aware of all of those type of things when you're considering your timber sale. Other things to think about when you're thinking about harvesting. Do you have any cultural resources on your property? And this may be something like the middle picture there, where you see a cemetery. And yes, the woods was harvested around that cemetery. And I know it looks like there's a tree that was harvested out of there. That tree actually had died and was taken out prior to the harvest. But when I was working with that particular logger on that piece, we made sure that he stayed back away from the cemetery, an appropriate piece, so that no damage was done to that site. Maybe you've got old home sites. The chimney that you see in the picture on the right-hand side, I find chimneys out in the woods fairly frequently. And so the other thing I think of when I see a chimney like that, it means that there's a house there. Was there or is there a well around there too? So just kind of be aware of those type of cultural resources. There may be a lot of others. There may be Native American sites that you need to be taking into consideration. And maybe the best way to handle those is complete avoidance of those areas, because you certainly don't want to be destroying those things. Stream crossings. Every place in Indiana, you have to cross a stream of some variety to get someplace else. But if it's just an intermittent stream, that's one thing. If it's a blue line stream, which is a permanent stream that says it has water in it most of the year or all of the year, crossing that with logging equipment presents a different type of issue. Loggers have access to bridges, temporary bridges. Many of them own their own. It's just easier for them. But every logging company has access to a bridge, because there are some bridges that are available for rent. And so the thing with the stream crossing is that it's a water quality issue. Definitely don't want to be running equipment up and down the streams. You want to be crossing those streams at right angles, and that minimizes any disturbance to the creek if you're going through it. And again, if it's a blue line stream, you do not want to be taking that equipment through the bed of the stream. Topography. And I think that one of the questions that was posed earlier was, what about real steep ground? Logging takes place on all types of ground. And I will tell you that I wouldn't want to be riding the skidder on some of the places, particularly Jackson County, Washington County, Clark County, where the hills are extremely steep, but it is done. There may be some places where you can't get to because of rock outcroppings. But topography is one of those things you do need to take into consideration, and whether can you sell timber in that particular area. Maybe you've got an extremely steep slope. Can you get the trees off there without causing damage. And the other thing too with topography is that you need to make sure you're not causing erosion through the harvesting of the timber. Springs, caves, sinkholes. In my part of the state, we have lots of sinkholes and caves, and some can be traversed without any problem. Others just have to be avoided. So all those type of things, you need to take into consideration what's in your woods and what is going to be a limitation. So how do you get started? And I heard from several of you, you have worked with a forester, and that is great. If you've never worked with a forester, probably your best first step is to contact the district forester who serves your county. And we have district foresters through the Division of Forestry who service every single county in Indiana. Now, other states, for those of you who are in have land in other states, I would recommend that you contact your local Division of Forestry, whether it's under the Department of Natural Resources or whatever that state happens to call it. But district forester, or in some states they call them service foresters. In Indiana, as Liz said, the district forester helps people with 10 acres or more. Our time is a little bit limited sometimes, but if you have questions about should you think about harvesting, and if so, get that district forester out there, have them walk the woods with you. They will explain the things that they're seeing out in the woods. They'll talk with you, ask you what you want to do with your woods, and from there can start planning a harvest for you. District foresters in Indiana do not mark timber. We had an agreement several years ago with the consulting foresters, and those are private foresters, and we don't want to compete with private enterprise. So if we go out there and are in your woods and say, yes, you really ought to, your woods is ready for a harvest. If you want one, we will then refer you to consulting forester. And these folks are going to charge, of course, for their services, but believe me, it is well worth what you have to pay for their services. They will go out, take a look at the boundaries. They will mark the timber for you. They will market the timber for you. They will be there at the time of sale, and they will be there after the sale, monitoring the sale, making sure that everything goes according to the contract. So again, a consulting forester is well worth the price that you pay for them. There are also company foresters, and there's less of those in Indiana. And again, they are a professionally trained forester. Just be aware that if they are working for a company, that's where their priority is going to lie, in that they are employed to help provide material for that company. I'm not discouraging you from using such a person. In many cases, it's a great contact, and it's just one of those that, again, they're looking at their company, but hopefully they're still looking at making sure that the woods is in good shape and that you get a fair price for your timber too. I think the first thing you really ought to do is get a management plan in place. That is a written document, and it is going to list what you've got out there. It's going to list your goals, and it's going to list what type of practices you're going to use to reach those goals, because everybody's goals are different. And if your goal is wildlife management, there are ways to use timber practices to achieve those wildlife management goals too. So get a plan in place, and the district forester can certainly create that for you. If you have 10 acres or more, consulting foresters can do that, and company foresters. Any forester can do that for you. If you choose not to do that, there are some other options. You can download a template from the American Tree Farm system, and it's kind of a plug and play type thing. You will be prompted with questions and you put your answers in there. And at the end, you'll have kind of a basic management plan that gives you some guidance on some things you do. I think from that point on, though, you still probably need to be involving a forester when you start implementing some of the practices. But again, having those long-term goals, that is key, because that dictates everything that you do in your woodlands to continue to keep it healthy. If you're harvesting timber, when is that going to happen? And so that plan should have a timetable in there for the practices that you're going to implement in your woods to perpetuate that woods in a manner that helps make the woodland sustainable. May include any type of pre or post-harvest practices. Someone said that, I think it was Karen, mentioned that she had a harvest, and after the harvest, these invasives came in. And there are some counties, and I know Perry County is one of those counties where autumn olive is a truly, truly invasive. Bush honeysuckle is another one. And what I would say there is that in developing that plan, that if you're using a forester, one of the things that forester is going to look at is what type of invasives do you have in there, and the timing of when you implement a timber harvest will also dictate when you should be working on those invasives. Many times you should be thinking about controlling the invasives 2 to 3 years at least before you have a harvest, because what's going to happen is, like in Karen's case, is that the timber harvest opened up the woods and those invasives just went crazy. So controlling those type of things. Grapevines the same way. If you have a grapevine problem, you really need to get those under control before a harvest, because again, after a harvest, that sun-loving plant just goes nuts. And it's much harder to control afterwards, because you're then having to walk through all of the downed treetops and things like that, any new growth that comes in. So those are some practices that you may want to consider pre-harvest. Post-harvest may include a little bit more timber stand improvement work. It may include closing out or improving a few of the trails that are left, although they should be left in good condition when the loggers leave the site. Boundaries. Do you know where your boundaries are? A lot of people don't. If you don't get out into your woods on a regular basis and check your boundaries, it's very easy not to know where you're at. And if you're using a forester, that's going to be one of the things that a consultant forester will do for you prior to marking your timber sale, is that they will mark their boundaries. Now, consulting foresters are not surveyors. So the boundary that they mark is not a legal survey, and keep that in mind. I would strongly recommend that if your boundary is up against a neighboring woodlands, consult with your neighbor, and out of courtesy, tell them that, hey, this is what we're planning. We're going to have a timber sale in here, and this is where we think the boundary is. Do you agree? And allow your neighbor the opportunity to go look, make sure that they agree with the boundary as marked, because it's so much easier to correct that problem prior to a harvest than after harvest. If you have a cornerstone, and cornerstones have been set all across the state, if you have one of those, that is just fantastic, because that gives you a good starting point to where you can run the boundary. Having a legal survey by a surveyor is expensive, although in some cases that may be necessary. So again, that's going to be another expense that you would incur if you did that. But again, if a consulting forester is just going to run the best survey line as possible. If there's fencing in trees, a lot of people swear by fences. recognize that fences sometimes are wrong. They were put in the wrong place to begin with, or it was convenient to put it in those trees. I've seen fences that zigzag, are not straight through the woods. So kind of take fences with a grain of salt. But again, they are a clue to where your boundary might possibly be. And if you can get your boundaries marked well, and again, working with your neighbor, there is a purple paint law. I don't know if many of you are aware of that. And Indiana enacted that in 2018. And it's where you mark your boundary with purple paint. And there are specifications on how far apart that paint mark is and how high off the ground, things like that. But if you do mark with purple paint, please, please, please use purple tree marking paint. Do not just go out to the local hardware store and buy purple paint. It will not last. But tree marking paint is what you need to mark those boundaries. And that paint will stay visible for a long time. People have asked me why purple. Honestly, I don't know. But Indiana was not the first state in the United States to implement this law. There are a lot of other states that have a purple paint law. So, and purple is just a kind of unusual color in the woods too, and it's not used for other things. So maybe that's why. So you've made the decision that you want to have a harvest. It's appropriate to have a harvest, and you have engaged a forester to come mark your trees. And that's what the consultant does, is mark the trees. And I was in a woods 2 weeks ago, didn't know the landowner was going to have a timber harvest, and I saw this paint in the tree. And so I kind of bristled at first, and then I looked a little closer and realized and relaxed because I knew that a consultant forester had marked the trees. How did I know? The consultant forester will always put paint at diameter breast height, or DBH, which is a standard unit of measurement that is 4.5 feet off the ground on the high side of the tree. And whether it's a spot of paint or a ring around the trees, a lot of consultants use a ring around the tree. That's what a forester will use. So will timber buyers. If they come into your woods, they will also mark like that. The difference between the two is that, and if you will look at the photo on the right-hand side, down at the very base of the tree, kind of on the left-hand side, you can just barely see the orange paint mark there. That is a stump mark. That is your mark. Says that once that tree has been severed, you know it was supposed to have been cut. The question I get a lot of times is, well, what's gonna, all these loggers, we all know that they're all crooks, which is of course not true. The majority of them are honest business people trying to make a living. Obviously, they want to get their product for the least expense that they can, but they want to be fair too. And so they will, if a forester is involved in your timber sale, first of all, that sends a message to potential buyers that says, hey, I've got a landowner here who cares and is going to be involved also. And I've never seen a case where theft has occurred on a forester involved sale, where a company came in and cut a tree down that wasn't supposed to be cut and then stump marked. They just don't do that. The other thing too is that consultant is back out there popping in at irregular intervals and watching over the logging. So that's a difference. When the timber is marked with a consulting forester, there's that mark at DBH that says to the cutter that yes, this tree goes, and then the stump mark is your mark saying that it is supposed to have been cut. So once the forester has all the trees marked, they're going to put together a listing of trees by species and estimated volume. And you will have a copy of that. And that's also what gets sent out to potential buyers. And that's, again, another thing the consulting forester will do. And if you don't have that listing, once you receive bids, how are you going to know if you are getting you don't know what you're selling. So educate yourself and all this process, which is what you're doing today. This is a good first step if you've not ever been involved in the process. But you need to know what you're selling, and that forester is also going to help you by guiding you along, telling you too that not only this is what you're selling, this is the quality of the trees that are being sold. The trees that you see with numbers on it, those are very, very high quality veneer trees, and they're oftentimes numbered separately. And the buyer then also knows that they're probably going to bid a little bit more on those trees too. Consultant is going to help you set the time and date and location of the sale. And usually we recommend a sealed bid sale. And that's where at this specific time, bids are opened. And it's not uncommon anymore for consultants to use phone bids. They will do that if they are very comfortable with the buyers that they normally work with. So that, and again, everybody's bidding on the same thing, and you can easily compare prices. There should be a contract. And again, the consulting forester is going to have a contract. There should be some standard things that are in that contract. It says what you're selling, who's selling it, who's buying it, location of it, length of time on the contract, and that will vary depending on your woods, access, things like that. 1 year is not unreasonable. It's common, but 2-year contracts are becoming a lot more common. And again, it's all going to depend on your situation and how easy can they get into the woods. Recognize that 1 year it sounds like a long time, but there's certain months out of that year they're not going to be able to harvest, or you definitely don't want them in your woods harvesting because it's too wet. If it's a wet winter, they may not be able to get to it until early summer or late spring. And the other thing too is that recognize that these timber buyers are constantly buying timber, and so they're having to juggle which jobs they're going to be going to. Your contract should also list any specific provisions you've got or any restrictions that might be occurring on there. So prices. Let's talk a little bit about prices. Housing starts are always one of the main drivers across the United States as far as what prices are doing. And if you are building a house, or you know someone who's building a house, you know this year that it's going to cost you about 30% more because price of lumber has gone up. And that is partly because the supply is down, and all this goes back to COVID. A lot of mills had to shut down, some of them permanently, and others are just now playing catch up too. And because of seasonal timing of things, again, wintertime, this year was not the best winter to be logging just because soils were wet in a lot of places. The other thing that happened this past year because of COVID is many people are working from home. You're sitting there looking at your computer screen, and then you're looking around at your home and thinking, you know what? We really need to start doing something about this kitchen or this bedroom or this whatever. And so a lot of remodeling started to happen this past year. And if you went to the lumber store, Lowe's, Menards, wherever, you found the price of a 2x4 had more than doubled in a lot of cases. So it takes a while for that to get back to stumpage prices, but it does eventually get there. Furniture sales this year have been up: flooring, cabinets, molding, doors, blinds, shutters, things like that. Pallets have been running pretty good for the last couple of years, and containers, and I mentioned whiskey barrels or bourbon barrels earlier. All those things have been driving up prices. Question right now is, how long are the good prices that we're in right now? How long are they going to last? And absolutely nobody has a crystal ball knowing how long they're going to last. just some programs and resources. And Liz had mentioned the Classified Forest and Wildlands program. And a couple of you I know have land in the program, so you know that you do get a reduction in your property taxes because it reduces the assessed value of your land. And those are the current rates, $14.43 per acre for 2021, payable next year, next spring. And that rate fluctuates from year to year. It's a variable rate, much like farm ground is, but it is still a much, much lower rate than regular woodlands or farm ground, and particularly housing sites. And many counties have invoked a rule where they say, you know, anything 10 acres or less, we're just going to assess it at the highest rate possible, which legally they can do that. And some counties have not invoked that so much, but the Classified Forest and Wildlands program, if you're eligible for it, that will help on your property taxes. Along with the program, there is also the Green Certification Program, and it does not cost you anything as a classified owner, but it is optional. You do not have to participate in it, and it does not affect your classified lands. But where green certification comes into play is when you sell products out of your woods, and timber is going to be the main product. So if you sell your timber through as green certified, then if the logger buys it as green certified, what it says is that you have adhered to a standard of management that's going to be sustainable. And then the logger has to abide by some rules too, again, using good standards of management. They can pass that on until you go back to Lowe's or Home Depot or wherever, and you buy that 2x4. And on the end of that 2x4, there's going to be a little piece of paper that says that it is FSC certified or one of the other certification programs that are available. Division of Forestry on Classified Forest and Wildlands, we use the Forest Stewardship Council certification program, and we are accountable to this non-governmental body that we get audited on it. And our audit says that we are helping our landowners be the best stewards they can be. Other programs, and Liz held up the Directory of Professional Foresters, and this is a great, great resource, and appreciate the Indiana Forest and Woodland Owners Association for putting this together every 2 years. Liz goes through this process. It is a listing of those consulting foresters who wish to be in the directory. It is not an endorsement of any forester, but there is information about each forester and what areas they serve. So that's a great resource there. And then Ron Rathbone and Lenny Farley, who are extension foresters with Purdue. Ron being in the southern part of the state at southern Indiana, Purdue Ag Center in DuBois County. And both these guys put on the 8-week short course for landowners, which was mentioned earlier. And I know this year when Lenny put it on, he just had a tremendous amount of people, which is great. It was online, and usually these programs are in person, and they're moved around the state to make it available to most people. If you ever have the chance to take this course, you should. It is just great. Both those guys are great teachers, and you will learn so much information that you didn't know you needed to know. American Tree Farm System, again, you can get on there with their templates. You can become a member of, you can be a tree farmer and get that really nice sign that says it's another symbol that you are willing to manage your land in a sustainable manner for all the resources out there. Tax implications, I mentioned that earlier. People don't have a clue about timber taxes a lot of times, including tax preparers. And so I have told tax preparers and landowners, go to this website. It is a great website, timbertax.org, and it will answer a lot of your questions. Cost share was mentioned earlier too, and most of our cost share programs for controlling invasives, for timber stand improvement, for tree planting, a lot of those type of things are run through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS office. Every county in Indiana is serviced by a county, but there may not be a USDA office in your particular county. It may be in the adjoining county. But again, if you're interested in cost share, that's the location to go to and get signed up. So things to expect. First of all, you've sold timber and the loggers are ready to move in. Be prepared. It is going to be loud and noisy. And depending on the size of your land, the size of the equipment, how much equipment actually shows up. At minimum, of course, you're always going to have chainsaws. There will be a skidder, which in the middle picture is the green machine on the left, the second one from the left. And there will be, of course, log trucks and something to load the logs onto the truck, which is on the left-hand side there. Hopefully, the logger will also have a bulldozer on site. The reason for the bulldozer is because the blade moves and they can fix the roads as they go, close things out at the very end. And roads, extremely important. Those roads should be maintained throughout the logging period in good condition. And again, you don't want loggers in there when it's too wet. They will rut things up. And yeah, you can smooth roads back over, but the damage to the soil, that's what you want to avoid. You do not want to damage that soil any more than it's going to be impacted anyway. The middle picture there is a log yard that's been completed. It has been smoothed over and seeded. And the grass or whatever they seeded out there is just not up yet, but it has been closed out. And of course, you are going to expect to see some tops in your woodlands. And it may look a little rough for a little while, but a good logging job should melt back into the landscape and disappear in 6 months. A bad logging job, and we've all seen them, you can drive down the road a year, 2 years later, and you still think, oh my gosh, something bad happened in here, and it did. Lower left-hand picture, that is actually a clear cut. And I know that when I said that word, a few of you kind of clinched because it has a bad connotation, which is unfortunate because it is truly a silvicultural practice that when applied in the right circumstances can provide you the benefits. And the main benefit of a clear cut is to regenerate a woods. And sometimes that's what you have to do. You have to just kind of start an area all over because the trees are mature, maybe they're damaged. You're just not getting the regeneration back in there that you need. And so many of the trees that are of the most value that we want in our woodlands need full sunlight. And so these type of openings can create those conditions for you. The middle picture is a skid trail, and this logger, who also happened to be the landowner, kind of went above and beyond what he needed to do. He smoothed out all of the road. He reopened some of those minor drainages, and then he put straw down on top of it too to help hold the soil, which is great. And that's again a consideration too, is making sure that those roads are closed out properly. And then on the right-hand side, that picture was taken the following growing season after harvest. And I defy you to look at that picture and say, hey, there's been a timber harvest in there. So many people think that a timber harvest destroys the woods, and your harvest should never destroy. It should not set back a woods. It should always be an improvement. And that's where, again, your goals and your management plan come into place to dictate what practices and how those practices are going to be implemented. Sometimes things don't go well. The picture on the left, it's hard to tell, but that road actually, that skid trail actually goes up a slope. You can see how rutted it is. And I'm standing in a stream bed, and that water and all of the soil was washing straight down into the stream bed. I had so many complaints on that. It was not one of my classified owners, and it was a logger who had no regard for the land. And that was the result. And I can tell you that woods, I have now been in it, and it is being placed in the classified program because it's changed ownerships. It still looks pretty rough, and it kind of looks like that middle picture there. And again, that was taken a couple years after harvest. Everybody can see that's not a good thing. You've got splintered trees, you've got broken trees, things that just don't look good. All the biggest and best trees have been taken out of the woods. So both of those pictures, center and the right, that's what's being shown there. I talked about natural disasters. The picture on the left, unfortunately, a tornado came through that woods. Woods wasn't ready to be harvested. The owner didn't want to. It ended up having to do that anyway. He had no control over that. So a salvage harvest took place in there. So it looked a little rough for a while, but again, it wasn't planned. The one on the right, when I walked into that woods and saw that, first I kind of grinned and then I cringed, because if you look closely, that skidder has no tire on the back, and it is propped very precariously on a block of firewood. I stepped back and took a picture of that. It was just kind of amazing. We all love our woods and we want to take care of them. And I hope today that I have answered some questions. There's so much detail that I just couldn't go into, but I'm very, very happy to answer questions right now. So thank you very much for your time.